I live in a busy neighborhood in the city, full of old buildings, windows practically pressed against one another, and people everywhere. But at night, everything gets strangely quiet, and any unusual sound stands out. I'm a single dad living in a small apartment with my dog, Thor, who's always been calm, almost lazy. Lately, though, he's been spending nights standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the ceiling, growling softly, like there's something up there. At first, I thought he was reacting to some noise from the apartment above or maybe a rat in the attic. But the way he looked up, ears perked, gave me an uneasy feeling. I tried to ignore it. After all, it's an old building, and odd noises could easily come from creaking pipes or the wind. Then, one night, I started hearing footsteps. Soft, light footsteps coming from the roof, right above my apartment. It wasn't constant, more like someone pacing back and forth, stopping intermittently. My first thought was a stray cat or maybe a bird, but the footsteps were too heavy for a small animal. To ease my curiosity, I bought a simple motion detector and pointed it toward the ceiling. I figured it would help confirm if anything was moving up there. The first night I set it up, it went off 2 or 3 times in the middle of the night. I rushed out to check, but there was nothing. Just Thor sitting there, his eyes fixed on the same spot on the ceiling. That's when the unease started to set in. The following night, I went to bed feeling tense, with Thor lying near my bedroom door instead of his usual spot in the living room. It was strange because he had never done that before. Around midnight, the motion detector went off again, startling me awake. I ran into the living room, and once again, there was nothing visible. Just Thor, his fur standing on end, staring intently at the ceiling, and an eerie silence filling the room. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe a tree branch scraping the roof or someone working late on the building, but none of it added up at that hour. The detector was basic but reliable. It shouldn't have gone off without reason. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like someone was observing my every move from a place I couldn't see. I decided to talk to my neighbor, a guy who had installed cameras on the building's exterior. He was a chill guy, a bit paranoid about security, and agreed to check the footage from the exterior cameras. Nothing fancy, just recordings of the building's entrance and sides. I wasn't expecting to find much. Maybe a cat climbing a wall or a large bird flapping around. But as we reviewed the footage from the previous night, we saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure, hooded, climbing the side of the building near my window. They moved cautiously, almost like a skilled burglar, but there was no clear view of their face or what they were doing. The most disturbing part was realizing that while I had been asleep, someone was on the roof, possibly peering through my skylight or doing something even worse. That's when it all clicked. Thor wasn't acting up for no reason. He had sensed someone's presence. I was paralyzed with fear. That same night, after seeing the footage, I went home determined to protect myself and my family. I locked all the windows, closed the curtains, and sat on the couch with Thor, who wouldn't stop growling softly and glancing upward. The feeling of being watched was so strong that I could almost feel eyes boring into me from above, waiting for the right moment to act. I kept trying to rationalize it. Who would climb onto the roof of an old building in the dead of night? A thief looking for an open window? A random lunatic trying to scare the residents? I couldn't make sense of it, but the worst part was not knowing how long it had been going on. Maybe those nights when Thor growled for no apparent reason weren't random at all. Maybe the intruder had been there all along, watching, studying our routines, learning every detail about my life and my child's. When the motion detector went off again that night, my heart nearly leaped out of my chest. I grabbed my phone, but there was no one to call at that hour, and calling the police without solid evidence felt excessive. Still, I cautiously opened the window to see if I could spot anything, but all I saw was the dark alley between the buildings. Thor was incredibly tense, growling so low it was almost a whimper. I felt a mix of anger and fear, a desperate urge to yell at whoever was up there, to tell them to stop this sick game. But I knew it wouldn't help. As I paced around the living room, I decided that at dawn, I would speak to more neighbors, check more cameras, do anything to identify this shadowy figure. I couldn't let my family live in fear. The next morning, Exhausted from barely sleeping, I went to the building manager. I explained the situation, the noises on the roof, the camera footage showing someone scaling the side of the building. At first, he looked skeptical, but when I showed him the video my neighbor had shared, I could see the concern on his face. He promised to check the building's other cameras, talk to the night security guard, and ask around if anyone had noticed anything unusual. While he did that, I spoke to a few neighbors in the hallway, asking if they had heard footsteps or seen anything strange. Most of them hadn't noticed anything, but an elderly lady from the floor above mentioned that her cat had been meowing incessantly and scratching at the laundry room window one night, as if something had spooked it. That only heightened my anxiety, confirming it wasn't just in my head. Later, the building manager called me to review additional footage. There were shaky images of someone moving across the neighboring building's rooftop, a quick silhouette disappearing into the shadows. It was hard to make out any features, but it was unmistakably human. This wasn't some large bird or stray cat. It was a person scaling walls and lurking around like they knew the area well. I started thinking about all the times I had slept soundly, completely unaware that someone might have been up there, watching. Thor, always so calm, had been the only one to sense the intruder. Without his behavior, I might never have investigated. Now, with the footage and reports, the situation felt even more chilling. How could someone climb a building unnoticed, spy on the residents, and vanish without a trace? And worse, how long had they been doing it? I began to feel paranoid, constantly checking the ceiling, double-checking window locks, and even rearranging furniture to block access to the skylight, though I knew it was a flimsy deterrent. The next night arrived faster than I'd hoped, and Thor remained on edge, growling softly every hour. I kept the TV on, unable to bear the silence, but still, every creak or faint noise made my heart race. My mind spiraled, wondering if the intruder wanted to steal something, or worse. It wasn't just fear of losing material possessions. It was the terror of having my family's privacy invaded, our safety compromised, by someone I couldn't see or understand. After several sleepless nights, I approached another neighbor who had cameras on the adjacent building. Reluctantly, he agreed to show me the older footage. We spent hours reviewing it, and in several clips, the shadowy figure appeared again, scaling rusted pipes, clinging to service windows, and vanishing into the darkness. The most disturbing realization was that these recordings weren't recent. Some were from 2 months ago. This person had been climbing around the building for weeks, maybe months, without anyone noticing. Knowing that someone had been observing us for so long sent chills down my spine. What were they waiting for? The right moment to break in? Or was it something even more sinister? Armed with this information, I called the police. 2 officers came to my apartment, listened to my story, watched the footage, and assured me they would increase patrols in the area. Still, without a clear suspect or evidence of a crime, there wasn't much else they could do. Their presence brought some comfort, but the damage was already done. For the next few nights, I stayed vigilant, listening for every sound while Thor kept his watchful eye on the ceiling. Strangely, the motion detector stopped going off, and I didn't hear footsteps again. Maybe the intruder had backed off, realizing they'd been noticed, but the fear remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence might be temporary, a trick to make me let my guard down. To this day, I don't know who that person was or what they wanted. There were no violent incidents, nothing went missing, and Thor eventually returned to his normal, laid-back self. But I've never been able to fully relax at night since then. Sometimes, when the apartment gets too quiet, I swear I hear faint footsteps, a wooden creak, or some other sound that sends me right back to that unsettling time. I turn on the TV, check the windows, and brace myself for the possibility that someone might still be watching. Maybe they've moved on to another building, another unsuspecting family. But I've learned one thing: danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's quiet, stealthy, and only your pet can sense it. That experience is etched into my mind, and even now, I can't find a logical explanation for what happened. My wife and I live in a quiet neighborhood with small houses, neatly kept gardens, and friendly people who greet you as they pass by. Our backyard is modest, but we take pride in it. Colorful flowers, a little herb garden, and even a few tomato plants we've carefully nurtured. Everything was fine until we started noticing something strange. Every morning, a few plants would be uprooted, as if someone had deliberately gone through our garden. At first, we thought it might be an animal, a stray cat, a raccoon, or maybe even a skunk looking for food. We tried to brush it off, but the damage got worse each day. One morning, we found strange footprints in the soil, not from an animal but clearly human. That realization made us deeply uneasy. Who on earth would sneak into a backyard to mess with plants? I decided to buy some motion-activated cameras, simple ones that record when they detect movement. I installed 2 in the backyard, pointing toward the garden beds, and went to bed feeling reassured, confident I'd have some answers the next day. But when I checked the footage, I was shocked. The recording stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., as if someone had cut the signal. At first, I thought it might be a malfunction, but this happened 3 nights in a row, always at the same time, and the recording never resumed after. My wife grew increasingly anxious, suggesting we call the police. But what could we even say? Hi! Someone's uprooting our plants, and our camera mysteriously stops recording at night. They'd think we were crazy. Still, I decided to keep a flashlight by the bedside, ready to check the window if anything happened again. The next night, we decided to stay awake. Around 1:30 a.m., my wife sat on the bed clutching a pillow while I peeked out from behind the curtains. The wind rustled the trees, and the street outside was silent except for a single street lamp casting light over the front yard. Around 3 a.m., we heard a faint noise, like something being dragged across the backyard. My heart started racing as my wife moved closer, trying to see what was out there. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, and I was sweating, gripping the flashlight tightly. Then, just a few minutes before 3:17 a.m., the backyard camera's feed went dead on my phone, as if it had been shut off. That's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the garden, a figure stood still, unmoving, staring directly at our bedroom window. There was no mistaking it. Someone was there, watching us, unblinking and motionless. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. They were too far away and cloaked in shadows, possibly wearing a hood or something similar. The sensation of being so deliberately, so intensely watched sent chills down my spine. My wife trembled beside me, trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure didn't move, just stared, as if studying our every reaction. Time felt frozen. My breathing grew heavier as I tried to think. Where had this person come from? How had they gotten into the yard without triggering the camera's sensors? And why did this always happen at the same time? My lips felt dry. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was certain this wasn't just an animal or some random occurrence. This was something intentional, something deeply unsettling. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before finally mustering the courage to shine the flashlight toward the garden. As soon as the light hit that corner, there was nothing there, just the bushes and the low fence. It sounds insane, but I swear the figure disappeared the instant the beam reached them. My wife grew even more distressed, whispering that we needed to call the police. I hesitated. The person had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. I opened the curtains a little wider, scanning the yard for any sign of movement, but all I saw was our disheveled garden, uprooted plants, and an unbearable silence. Maybe they had crouched down, hidden behind something, or climbed over the fence without us noticing. The overwhelming sense of being hunted, of being watched like prey in a cage, left me deeply unsettled. My wife grabbed her phone and tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't go through. We couldn't tell if it was a signal issue or something else. That only heightened our feeling of helplessness. We kept watching the backyard, our eyes darting to every shadow, waiting for any sign of movement. But nothing happened. After what felt like hours, I decided to go downstairs and check the locks on the back door. Everything was secure. The fence gates were also firmly latched, with no signs of tampering. When I returned to the bedroom, my wife looked pale and shaken. The idea of someone sneaking into our backyard to do something so specific, so strange, and then disappearing without a trace was deeply disturbing. We didn't know what to do for the next night: set traps, install more cameras, or finally call the police. But the fear of that presence returning hung over us like a dark cloud. The next day, we spent hours inspecting every inch of the yard in daylight. I crouched near the garden beds, searching for any clues, footprints, items left behind, anything to explain what was happening. My wife examined the fence and walls, trying to figure out how someone could get in without us hearing. We found broken branches, soil disturbed in ways that didn't seem accidental, and footprints that didn't belong to anyone in our household. They were large, likely from an adult, and carefully placed, almost as if the person wanted to leave a trail. We considered talking to the neighbors, but didn't want to cause panic or seem paranoid without solid proof. Our only evidence was the camera footage that froze at the exact same time each night and the figure we'd seen with our own eyes. That was the most haunting part, the memory of that fixed gaze on our bedroom window, unblinking and utterly silent. We decided to install another camera, this time on the roof with a wider angle covering the entire yard. We also reinforced the window locks and added an extra bolt to the back door. My wife still wanted to call the police, but what could we report? Nothing had been stolen or broken. Someone had simply stood there, watching. Even so, the idea of a stranger so close to us, invading our space, left me uneasy. That night, we stayed up again, watching from the window and monitoring the new camera feed on my phone. Everything seemed normal until, just minutes before 3:17 a.m., the feed began glitching, flickering as if it were receiving interference. My heart sank. I knew what was coming. And then, from the same dark corner of the yard, the silhouette appeared again, motionless, staring directly at our bedroom window as if it knew exactly where we were. This time, I didn't shine the flashlight or open the window. I just watched, a terrible chill running through me, as the figure remained still. It felt like it was taunting us, showing that it could appear and disappear at will, leaving us powerless. My wife gripped my arm tightly, breathing heavily, her eyes fixed on the shadow. I couldn't look away either, trying to commit every detail to memory, hoping to identify something. But the figure was featureless, just a dark outline, completely still. It didn't flinch or make any sudden moves, almost like a statue. It felt less like a person and more like a presence, something malevolent but intangible. Yet, I refused to believe it was supernatural. I was convinced it was someone real, someone incredibly clever, who knew exactly how to terrify us. When the clock struck 3:17, the figure simply vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My wife began crying softly, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I didn't know what to do. Going outside was out of the question, and calling the police felt pointless since they'd arrived too late. We just sat there in silence, staring at the empty yard, trying to understand how someone could disappear so quickly. Had they jumped the fence, hidden in the bushes, or had they never really been there at all? We had no answers, only a growing fear and the certainty that we weren't imagining things. Someone or something was toying with us, appearing at the same time, sabotaging our cameras, and leaving us trapped in our own backyard. In the days that followed, I tried to keep up with my routine, going to work and pretending everything was fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. We avoided touching the cameras or the garden, afraid of provoking another visit. I spoke to a couple of nearby neighbors, but they said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. My wife grew quieter, always checking the clock as midnight approached. The yard looked the same, but it felt different, heavier, as if the air carried the weight of those unsettling nights. One of my desperate attempts to reclaim some sense of security was installing brighter lights in the garden, hoping they'd deter whoever or whatever it was. But the image of that figure standing perfectly still, watching us, never left my mind. I had no idea how to stop it, and that helplessness was the worst part. It felt like we were at the mercy of an invisible invader. Strangely, after that night, nothing happened again. No uprooted plants, no footprints, no glitches in the cameras, no sign of the figure. It was as if it had all ended as abruptly as it had started. My wife and I took a long time to relax, jumping at every sound, but eventually, the nights passed without incident. To this day, we don't know what happened. Whether it was a disturbed neighbor, a deranged trespasser, or something beyond explanation, all that remains is the memory of that paralyzing fear, the feeling of being watched, and the suffocating silence of those nights. Sometimes, when I look at the garden, I still feel a shiver, remembering that shadow standing in the back, as if it left a permanent mark on our memories. Life has moved on, but we never found any answers. I worked the night shift at a packaging factory, a place that used to be quiet and even a little boring, but lately, things have taken a strange turn. My routine is usually straightforward. Walk the halls, check the machines, make sure the conveyor belts are stopped, and fill out some mundane reports. There's hardly anyone in the building besides the security guard at the front gate, and he mostly stays outside in the lot. But recently, I've started noticing odd things out of place. Boxes stacked where they shouldn't be, tools on the floor for no apparent reason, and strange noises echoing through the factory in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion making me overthink small details. After all, your mind can play tricks on you when it's silent, right? But one night, as I was in a more isolated corner of the factory, I noticed one of the machines had started running on its own. It happened the moment I turned my back for a few seconds, and when I looked again, the conveyor belt was moving slowly, making that dragging sound, even though I was absolutely certain I had turned it off. I ran to the main panel to cut the power, thinking it was a short circuit, an electrical issue, or maybe just me forgetting. But when I checked, everything was fine, no signs of a malfunction. The silence that followed was chilling. The only sounds were my racing heartbeat and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I wanted to believe it was just a quick glitch, but deep down, I felt it wasn't that simple. The next night, everything seemed normal until I went into the break room. It's a small space with a worn-out couch, a table, and an old cabinet filled with dusty paperwork that no one's touched in years. I decided to make some coffee, and while the machine heated up, I opened the cabinet, more out of curiosity than necessity. Inside were old folders, their labels faded and yellowed with age. One of them caught my attention because it had a name I recognized. It belonged to someone who used to work the night shift before me, though I didn't know much about them. As I flipped through the pages, I found something deeply unsettling. It seemed several people who had worked this shift before had disappeared over the years. Not fired, not transferred, disappeared. The notes were vague, but some mentioned investigations that had gone nowhere. That revelation lingered in my mind for the rest of the night. Why had no one ever mentioned this? Why were people still working the night shift if this was the history? I tried to brush it off and continued my rounds, but the feeling that something wasn't right only grew stronger. When I reached one of the conveyors to check the machinery, I smelled a strong scent of grease, like someone had recently worked on it. I looked around but didn't see anyone. Then I noticed something written in grease on one of the conveyor rollers. I stepped closer to read it, and my stomach dropped when I saw the words, "You're next." The handwriting was crude, almost like it had been scrawled hastily, but clear enough to get the message across. My whole body went cold. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, but there was no denying what I saw. Someone or something wanted me to see that, and suddenly the silence in the factory felt oppressive, even menacing. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call security, but when I checked my pocket, I realized I'd left it in the break room. That realization only heightened my anxiety. I scanned the area, searching for any sign that someone was there, but all I saw was the empty space, the harsh glow of the overhead lights, and the faint hum of inactive machines. My hands were trembling, and the smell of grease felt even stronger, almost suffocating. I decided to get out of there as quickly as possible and headed back to the break room, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the quiet. When I got there, my phone was exactly where I'd left it, but for some reason, I hesitated to call anyone. Who would believe me? What would I even say? "Hi, there's something weird written on a conveyor belt, and I think I might disappear next." I decided to push through and finish my shift. I ignored the messages and continued my rounds, but the feeling of being watched followed me everywhere. As the night went on, the factory seemed to change. The long, empty hallways I knew so well began to feel like a maze, and every shadow seemed to shift at the edge of my vision. I heard unidentifiable sounds, footsteps blending with the echo of my own boots, or machines turning on and off, even when I was sure they were off. Passing one of the storage racks, I noticed a box on the floor, its contents scattered as if someone had shoved it. I bent down to pick up the mess, but as I did, I felt an overwhelming sensation that something, or someone, was watching me from above. I snapped my head up, but the space was as empty as ever. Still, the factory felt alive, but not in the way it should. Later that night, while doing a final check near the loading area, I heard a faint, rhythmic noise coming from one of the machines. It sounded like something being dragged. I cautiously approached, flashlight in hand, and saw that one of the conveyors, which I was certain had been off, was moving slowly. The strangest part was that there was nothing on it, just the sound of the belt turning. I walked over to the control panel to shut it down, but the switch was already in the off position. My body went cold, and the flashlight trembled in my hand. Then, I felt an icy chill on the back of my neck, as if someone were standing right behind me. I froze, too scared to turn around, listening to my shaky breaths mingling with the sound of the conveyor. When I finally summoned the courage to turn, there was no one there. But I noticed that one of the supply room doors was open. That door should have been locked, and I was the only one with the key that night. I walked toward it cautiously, flashlight aimed inside. Shelves were disorganized, tools and boxes strewn across the floor. At the far end of the room, a shadow loomed, as if someone were standing there. But when I pointed the light, there was nothing. The feeling of not being alone was so intense that I had to leave immediately. I ran to the control room, locked the door, and sat down, trying to think of what to do. My shift still had a few hours left, but every instinct told me I needed to leave. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, none of it made sense. The message on the conveyor now felt less like a coincidence and more like a direct threat. I called the security guard, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. He answered groggily, clearly unconvinced. When I mentioned the message on the conveyor and the disarray in the supply room, he dismissed it, saying it's probably just the wind or a power glitch. Frustrated but unwilling to argue, I decided I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things, locked the control room, and made my way to the exit. The silence in the corridors was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my boots on the floor. Every step felt like something was trailing me, but each time I looked back, there was nothing there. Just as I approached the exit and saw the dim light of the gatehouse, a loud, metallic sound echoed from behind me, like a machine starting up again. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep walking. I wasn't going back to check, not that night. Before leaving, something compelled me to glance back one last time. That's when I saw it. A shadow at the end of the hallway, standing perfectly still. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. It was tall, indistinct, and seemed to blend with the surrounding darkness. I froze, unable to breathe, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't wait to see more. I ran to the gatehouse, got in my car, and drove home as fast as I could. Even then, the fear stayed with me, like something had followed me out of the factory. At home, I was still in shock. My body felt heavy, my mind racing in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened. I spent the night on the couch, the TV on low just to have some noise. Every time the silence settled, I heard the sounds in my head, the machines turning on and off, the conveyor belt humming, and that metallic clanging. I couldn't forget the shadow at the end of the hall, staring at me as if it knew I was afraid. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't rationalize it. Who or what was in that factory, messing with the machines, writing messages, and, most disturbingly, why? The next day, I told my supervisor I wasn't coming back for the night shift. He didn't ask many questions, maybe sensing something in my voice, and said he'd try to move me to a day shift. Even so, I've never been able to step into that factory without feeling a shiver down my spine. To this day, I don't know if it was a cruel prank, some unexplained malfunction, or something far more sinister. All I know is that I can't enter an empty space without checking every corner, listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there. That message, "You're next," still echoes in my mind, a chilling reminder that, even though I left, something or someone might still be watching.